Los Angeles was bathed in golden sunlight, the afternoon heat shimmering over the asphalt roads. Clint Eastwood drove his classic vintage car through the quieter streets, his sharp eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Despite his years, his presence remained as imposing as ever. A living legend, a man whose name was synonymous with the Wild West, justice, and unwavering grit. He had just finished promoting his latest film, a grueling series of press conferences and interviews. Now all he wanted was a moment of peace, somewhere quiet, away from flashing cameras and insistent reporters. He longed for a small cafe where he could sit by the window, sip a hot coffee, and perhaps get lost in the pages of an old Western novel. As he drove, he spotted a charming little coffee shop tucked into a quiet corner of the city. The sign above read Rustic Bean, and something about it called to him. He pulled over, turned off the engine, and stepped out, feeling the warmth of the sun on his weathered skin. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries. It was a modest place, with wooden chairs and shelves lined with books, the kind of cafe where no one expected to see a Hollywood legend walk through the door. That suited Clint just fine. He ordered a black coffee and found a seat by the window. As he wrapped his fingers around the warm cup, he exhaled, feeling the tension in his shoulders ease. He had barely taken his first sip when the bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of a new customer. A small boy, no older than 8, burst into the cafe, his excitement practically radiating from him. His tousled brown hair bounced as he ran forward, eyes wide and gleaming. A woman, presumably his mother, hurried in behind him, calling after him. But the boy had already seen Clint. He skidded to a stop, his mouth slightly agape. "Mom, it's him!" the boy whispered loudly, pointing in Clint's direction. His voice carried across the small cafe, drawing a few glances from other customers. Clint set down his coffee and turned his gaze to the boy. He had seen this look before, the uncontainable excitement of a fan who had just spotted their hero. The boy took a hesitant step forward, then another, before finally gathering the courage to approach. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "Are you Clint Eastwood?" Clint's lips twitched, threatening to form a smile. He studied the boy for a moment before giving a slow, deliberate nod. The boy gasped. "I can't believe it. You're my favorite actor," Clint chuckled. "That's so?" The boy nodded vigorously. "My dad and I watch your movies all the time. You're the coolest cowboy ever, the fastest gun in the West." Clint leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Well now, that's quite the compliment." The boy's excitement only grew. "One day I want to be just like you, a real cowboy." Clint tilted his head. He had heard similar things over the years, fans admiring his toughness, his gunslinging skills, his fearless demeanor. But this boy's enthusiasm was different. It wasn't just admiration. It was a dream. "You want to be a cowboy, huh?" Clint asked. The boy nodded so fast his hair bounced. "Yes, sir. I want to learn how to ride a horse, shoot like you do, and stand up to bad guys." Clint took a slow sip of his coffee before setting it down. "Well, son, there's more to being a cowboy than just riding and shooting." The boy frowned. "There is," Clint nodded. "A real cowboy ain't just about the fastest draw or the toughest stare. It's about honor, respect, and knowing right from wrong." The boy's expression turned thoughtful. "So, being a cowboy means being a good person?" Clint smiled, a rare sight. "That's exactly what it means." At that moment, the boy's mother finally reached them, slightly out of breath. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Eastwood. My son is a huge fan, but I hope he's not bothering you." Clint waved a dismissive hand. "Not at all, ma'am. In fact, I was just thinking of teaching this young man a thing or two about being a real cowboy." The boy's eyes widened. "Really? You'd teach me?" Clint nodded. "Sure, but only if you're serious about it." The boy's face lit up with excitement. "I am, I promise." Clint finished his coffee and stood up. "All right then, little fella. Let's step outside. Lesson number 1 is about to begin." The boy practically jumped with excitement, following Clint eagerly as they made their way outside. The mother watched them go, a mixture of amusement and gratitude in her eyes. As they stepped out into the warm sunlight, Clint realized something. He had spent his whole life playing cowboys on screen, but maybe, just maybe, today he had the chance to be one for real. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something unexpected, a sense of purpose. The sun hung high in the sky as Clint Eastwood and the eager young boy stepped outside the small cafe. The gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh baked pastries from inside, but the boy hardly noticed. His heart was pounding with excitement. "All right, kid," Clint said, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt. "Lesson number 1. A cowboy doesn't just carry himself with strength, he carries himself with respect." The boy tilted his head. "Respect?" Clint nodded. "Respect for people, respect for the land, and most importantly, respect for yourself." The boy's mother, who had followed them outside, folded her arms, watching with curiosity. "I have to say, Mr. Eastwood, I didn't expect you to give my son a cowboy lesson today." Clint gave a slight smirk. "Neither did I, ma'am, but seems like the boy's got the heart for it." The boy puffed out his chest. "I do." Clint chuckled, then pointed to a row of benches lined along the sidewalk. "All right, son, let's start simple. See those benches over there?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Imagine you're riding into a new town. You don't know nobody and they don't know you. First thing a real cowboy does?" Clint paused, letting the moment build. Then he tipped his imaginary hat. The boy's face scrunched up in confusion. "A tip of the hat?" "That's right," Clint said. "A cowboy acknowledges folks, shows them he ain't trouble. That's respect. Now let's see you try it." The boy hesitated for a moment, then copied Clint's movement, pretending to tip a hat that wasn't there. "Like this?" Clint nodded approvingly. "Good. Now if a man tips his hat back at you, what do you do?" The boy thought for a moment. "Smile?" Clint chuckled. "That works. But a real cowboy also knows when to stand tall. He don't bow to nobody unless they've earned it." The boy's mother watched with amusement. "I never thought learning to be a cowboy was so much about manners." Clint turned to her with a serious look. "Ma'am, a cowboy who ain't got manners ain't got nothing." The boy grinned. "What's next?" Clint crossed his arms. "Next comes something a bit tougher. Lesson number 2, courage." The boy's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Like fighting bad guys?" Clint shook his head. "Courage ain't just about fighting. Sometimes it's about knowing when not to fight." The boy frowned. "What do you mean?" Clint looked down the road as if searching for a way to explain it. Then he turned back to the boy. "Ever seen a bully pick on someone smaller than them?" The boy nodded slowly. "Yeah, there's a kid at my school. He always picks on my friend Daniel." Clint knelt slightly to be at eye level with the boy. "And what do you do about it?" The boy shifted uncomfortably. I don't know. I want to help, but I don't want to get in trouble." Clint studied the boy carefully. "Let me tell you something, kid. A real cowboy don't look the other way when someone's in trouble. He steps up, even when it's scary." The boy swallowed hard. "But what if the bully hurts me?" Clint placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "Son, sometime standing up to the bad guy ain't about throwing punches. Sometimes it's about speaking up, looking them in the eye and letting them know they ain't got power over you." The boy processed this, nodding slowly. "So, if I tell the bully to stop, I'm being a cowboy?" "You're being a good man," Clint corrected. "And good men make great cowboys." The boy's mother looked at Clint with gratitude. "That's actually some of the best advice my son has ever gotten." Clint shrugged. "Just passing down what I know, ma'am." The boy beamed. "So what's next? Do I get to learn how to do a quick draw?" Clint chuckled. "We'll get to that, but first there's one more lesson for today." The boy leaned in eagerly. "Lesson number 3, Clint said, his voice low and serious. "A cowboy keeps his word." The boy blinked. "Always?" Clint nodded. "Always. A man is only as good as his word. If he says he's going to do something, he does it. No excuses. No backing out. That's what makes a cowboy trustworthy." The boy's mother sighed. "Wish more people lived by that rule these days." Clint smiled slightly. "So do I, ma'am. So do I." The boy clenched his fist with determination. "Then I promise, I'll always keep my word." Clint extended his hand. "Well then, You just made your first cowboy oath, and a cowboy always shakes on it. The boy grinned, grabbing Clint's hand in a firm shake. Clint smiled, seeing the boy's enthusiasm. Maybe he had played cowboys all his life, but today he had just made a real one. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of pride. The lessons of the West weren't just about gunfights and glory. They were about character, strength, and honor. And as Clint walked back toward his car, he turned back one last time. See you around, cowboy. The boy grinned, tipping his imaginary hat. See you around, Mr. Eastwood. As Clint drove away, he realized that even in a world that had long moved past the days of the Wild West, there were still young hearts eager to learn what it truly meant to be a cowboy. And that was enough to make an old gunslinger smile. The days following Clint Eastwood's unexpected cowboy lesson were some of the most exciting in the young boy's life. He practiced tipping his imaginary hat at strangers, stood up straighter when he walked, and most importantly, kept his word whenever he made a promise. But the real test came on a cloudy Wednesday afternoon. It started as most trouble did in the schoolyard. The boy, now feeling like a real cowboy in training, had been sitting on a bench eating his lunch when he heard the familiar sound of trouble brewing. "Hey, loser! Give me your lunch!" The boy turned his head and saw exactly what he had feared. A taller, mean-looking kid named Trevor had grabbed Daniel's lunchbox. Daniel, a quiet, shy kid with oversized glasses, looked terrified. His hands trembled as he tried to take a step back. "I said gimme it!" Trevor barked, shoving Daniel against the fence. The boy's heart pounded. This was it. This was the moment Clint had talked about. A real cowboy don't look the other way when someone's in trouble. The boy swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if his legs were shaking from fear or excitement, but before he could second-guess himself, he stood up. "Hey, Trevor!" The bully turned, his expression shifting from amusement to mild surprise. "What do you want?" The boy took a deep breath and stepped forward, just like Clint had said. "Leave him alone." A few kids nearby turned to watch, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Trevor sneered. "Or what?" The boy held his ground, his fists clenched, but he remembered Clint's words. Courage wasn't about fighting. It was about standing tall. "Or you'll regret it," the boy said firmly. Trevor laughed. "Yeah? And what are you going to do, cowboy?" He said the word mockingly. "Gonna ride off into the sunset?" The other kids chuckled. The boy's face turned red, but he didn't back down. Instead, he tipped his imaginary hat and gave Trevor a stare, cold and unflinching. Trevor's smirk faded slightly. "What's with the weird look?" "You know," the boy said, keeping his voice steady. "Clint Eastwood told me that real cowboys don't pick on people smaller than them, 'cause that just means they're afraid inside." Trevor blinked. "Wait, what? Clint Eastwood?" "Yeah," the boy said. "And he told me that people like you only act tough because they don't have the courage to be good men." A hush fell over the group. Trevor's face twitched. "That's stupid," he muttered. The boy shrugged. "Maybe, but you're still the one stealing lunch from a kid half your size." Trevor glanced at the crowd, realizing that the laughter had stopped. The other kids were watching him, not with admiration, but with quiet judgment. Slowly, his grip on Daniel's lunchbox loosened. He looked down as if considering his next move. For a brief moment, the boy thought Trevor might actually change. But instead, Trevor scoffed and shoved the lunchbox back into Daniel's hands. "Whatever. You two are losers anyway." And just like that, he turned and stomped off. The boy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Daniel looked up at him in awe. You stood up for me." The boy smiled, brushing imaginary dust from his shirt. "That's what cowboys do." One of the other kids nearby, a girl named Emily, grinned. "That was pretty cool. Where'd you learn to stare like that?" The boy smirked. "Clint Eastwood taught me." The kids laughed, but this time it wasn't mocking. It was admiration. Daniel gave a small smile. "Thanks, I mean it." The boy nodded. "Always keep your word. That's cowboy rule number 3. And at that moment, he realized something important. Being a cowboy wasn't about having a horse or a hat. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it was scary. And as the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, he knew one thing for certain. Clint Eastwood would have been proud. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. but for the boy, it felt like the beginning of something new. As he stepped out of the school building, he noticed the subtle change in the air. The weight of the world felt a little lighter, and the crowd of kids around him didn't seem as daunting as it once had. He walked with a newfound confidence, his shoulders squared, his head held high. The events of the day played over and over in his mind, each moment etched into his memory like a cowboy's brand on the open range. As he made his way down the familiar path to his house, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling in his chest. What had seemed like just another ordinary day at school had turned into something much more significant. The lesson Clint Eastwood had taught him about courage, respect, and keeping your word had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully understand yet, but he knew it had changed him forever. At home, his mom greeted him with a warm smile. She had noticed the difference in him the moment he walked through the door. "What's got you so bright-eyed today?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. The boy sat down at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the wood, as if the lessons from that day had settled deep within him. "It's nothing, really," he said, his voice steady. "Just keeping my word, like Clint taught me." His mom raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Clint? You mean Clint Eastwood?" The boy nodded, a proud grin spreading across his face. "Yeah. He taught me that being a cowboy isn't just about how fast you draw a gun or how tough you look. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." His mom leaned in, intrigued by the intensity in her son's voice. "And you learned that from him?" "Yeah," the boy said softly, his gaze distant for a moment. "He said that courage isn't just about fighting. Sometimes it's knowing when not to fight, and that a real cowboy always keeps his word." She was silent for a moment, taking in his words. "Well, I'm proud of you, kiddo. Sounds like you learned some pretty important lessons today." The boy smiled. "Thanks, Mom. I feel like I'm different now, like I'm ready for whatever comes next." That night, as he lay in bed, the boy thought about everything Clint had taught him. He thought about how scared he had been standing up to Trevor, the bully who had tormented Daniel. But in that moment, when he had faced down his fear and held his ground, he had felt something inside him shift. It wasn't about being the toughest or the loudest. It was about being true to who you were, about knowing what was right and standing firm, even when the odds were against you. The next day at school, things were quieter. Trevor didn't bother Daniel, and even the other kids seemed to look at the boy with a different kind of respect. They weren't teasing him anymore, or making fun of his quiet nature. It was as if, in standing up for what was right, he had earned something far more valuable than just their attention. He had earned their respect. At lunch, Emily, the girl who had admired his bravery the day before, came over and sat next to him. She smiled, her voice a little softer than usual. "That was really cool what you did, standing up to Trevor like that." The boy shrugged, trying to act casual, though his chest swelled with pride. "It wasn't that big of a deal. Just did what Clint said. You know, don't look away when someone needs help." Emily raised her eyebrows. "Clint? You mean Clint Eastwood?" He nodded. "Yeah. He told me that real cowboys don't pick on people weaker than them, and they don't let bullies get away with it." "Sounds like good advice," Emily said, giving him a thoughtful look. "I bet a lot of people could learn something from that." The boy nodded, his mind racing with all the things Clint had taught him. The lessons weren't just for him, they were for everyone. "Yeah," he said softly, "maybe we all could." As the day wore on, the boy found himself reflecting on the words Clint had spoken. The lesson about courage had stayed with him the most. It wasn't just about fighting or standing tall in the face of danger. It was about the quiet moments, the decisions made when no one was looking. It was about being a man of honor, a person who didn't back down from what was right, even if it meant standing alone. The boy's resolve only grew stronger. He knew that one day he would be the one passing down these lessons to someone else. Maybe it wouldn't be in the schoolyard, and maybe it wouldn't be with a bully in front of him, but there would come a time when he would have to stand firm, when he would have to make a choice. And when that time came, he would remember Clint Eastwood, the man who had shown him what it truly meant to be a cowboy. That evening, the boy sat outside on the porch, the cool evening breeze brushing against his face. He gazed at the horizon, his mind swirling with thoughts of the lessons he had learned, the journey he was on. He wondered what Clint would think if he knew how much of an impact he had made. "I'll always keep my word," the boy whispered to the wind, echoing the vow he had made earlier. And in that moment, he understood. Being a cowboy wasn't just about the past or the myths of the Wild West. It was about the choices we make every day. It was about being true to ourselves, respecting others, and always standing up for what's right. Clint Eastwood had taught him that, and for that, the boy would be forever grateful. The next few days passed quietly, but the boy never stopped practicing what Clint had taught him. He stood taller, spoke with more confidence, and treated everyone with the respect they deserved. He kept his promises no matter how small. He lived each day as a cowboy would, with honor and courage. And as he walked through the halls of his school, he began to notice something. He wasn't just gaining the respect of his peers, he was gaining their trust. The same trust Clint Eastwood had built throughout his career. He was becoming the kind of person others could rely on. One day, a year later, as the boy stood in front of the school assembly, he realized just how far he had come. He had been chosen to speak about courage and kindness, about standing up for what was right. The boy, now a little older, a little wiser, stood at the podium, thinking back to the lessons that had shaped him. He smiled, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Sometimes," he said, his voice steady, "being a cowboy isn't about the gun you carry or the horse you ride. It's about the person you are on the inside. A cowboy's strength comes from his heart." And as he spoke those words, he knew one thing for certain. Clint Eastwood would have been proud. As the applause rang in his ears, the boy felt a deep sense of peace. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was becoming the man Clint had taught him to be. And that, he realized, was the greatest lesson of all. The sun set outside, painting the sky in shades of gold, as the boy tipped his imaginary hat, knowing that somewhere out there, Clint Eastwood was still watching, and he was still teaching.